Welcome to Matters Financial and Geopolitical from the Frontier. Thank you for stopping by. Let me start with some macro thoughts. EU Chief Negotiator Michel Barnier says a Brexit deal with the UK is realistic within 6 to 8 weeks. This pops sterling higher, just shy of 130.50. And I think increasingly the EU is looking to triangulate Boris Johnson to deal with Theresa May through this tricky situation, and essentially are looking to give her a lot more leeway in that negotiation. Nike's stock regains ground after it saw a $4.16 billion sell-off during the Copernic ad controversy. This I concluded as an interesting plot twist, and ultimately the market is the message. And Nike will take some comfort from the message that the market is sending them. Home thoughts, I like this. Good evening, Tanzania from K. Kagasheki. This is a photograph of a dhow, and that took me back to Professor Felipe Fernandez Armesto, who said the precocity of the Indian Ocean as a zone of long-range navigation and cultural exchange is one of the glaring facts of history, made possible by the reversible escalator of the monsoons. Basically, you could catch a dhow in India. The monsoon wind would bring you all the way down the east coast of Africa as far as Durban, and then the wind after a few weeks would turn around and take you all the way back. And I remember a time when I was a very young boy that the Mombasa harbour would be filled with dhows. That seems like an eternity ago. It's a whale and its calf in the Hotan waters. I've missed that this year. It seems there's a whale to be seen every day. This is a photograph of my daughter Layla and Akiba, who was our guide in the Meru National Park, and we had a sundowner, and you can see the sun in the background. Layla's been with us for a few weeks, and it took me back to the time I picked her up from the school disco when she was around 11. And I asked, "Darling, how was it?" And she said, "Daddy, I danced and I danced and I didn't stop." And I remember that time as if it was yesterday. Her eyes glittered. She could scarcely stand still. I wanted to pick her up, spin her round, because as Jean Rhys wrote in her novel, Wide Sargasso Sea, only the magic and the dream are true. All the rest's a lie. This is an iconic moment with a desert-adapted giraffe in the Hotan Valley. This is from We Are Wilderness. My mind has been on giraffes, but it took me back to a book I read by J.M. Ledgard called Giraffe. And in that he said, "Our souls are made of water," Goethe says, "so too our bodies. There is a flow within us, rising and falling, unidirectional to the heart. There is a flow without also. We circulate, we are drawn up, we fall back down to earth again. It's all hemodynamics." This is a photograph I took over the weekend of a Tower of Giraffes in the foreground. You can see Elsa's copy in the background. Staying with J.M. Ledgard, but jumping to another book I read of his called Submergence. Jinn occupy bodies which are in a liminal state, when consciousness is a sheet of copper beaten down, mirroring only the moment. Meanwhile, staying with giraffes in the Eastern Cape, South Africa, there are some pretty harsh and unusual weather conditions. This is from the Africa Why I Live Here Facebook page. You can see the snow. And then again with J.M. Ledgard, Submergence. The strangest life exists in the cracks. Until the discovery of hydrothermal vents off the Galapagos Islands in 1977, scientists assumed that life on Earth was photosynthetic and belonged to the surface. It was the other way round. Photosynthetic life came later, when cells strayed to the top, where they were cooked for millions of years before evolving a way to absorb the light, and all the while the chemosynthetic life in the abyss was evolving a stability we cannot hope for. Political reflections: information flow is not a neutral phenomenon. It is related to the movement of power through a society. Julian Assange. That took me back to information warfare will not be couched in the rationale of geopolitics, but will be spawned like any Hollywood drama out of raw emotions. One of the defining bifurcations of the future will be the conflict between information masters and information victims. This is a photograph of the Hotan County Concentrated Transformation Through Education Center, somewhere in Xinjiang, where the Chinese are performing an extraordinary experiment of brainwashing an entire population to reject their religion. As with the threat of a cholera epidemic in Basra, Iraq crises tend to spread swiftly and infect the whole region. This is a story which is seemingly being played down. The current protests in Iraq are the most serious seen in the country for years and are taking place at the heart of some of the world's largest oil fields. The Iraqi government headquarters in Basra was set ablaze, as were the offices of those parties and militias, blamed by local people for their wretched living conditions. Protesters have blockaded and closed down Iraq's main seaport at Qasr, through which it imports most of its grain and other supplies. Mortar shells have been fired into the green zone in Baghdad for the first time in years. At least 10 people have been shot dead by security forces over the last 4 days, in a failed effort to quell the unrest. If these demonstrations had been happening in 2011, during the Arab Spring, then they would be topping the news agenda around the world. As it is, the protests have so far received very limited coverage in international media, which is focusing on what might happen in the future in Idlib, Syria, rather than events happening in Iraq. This is the handshake on the White House lawn sealing the first of the landmark Oslo Accords, which inspired hope that Israeli-Palestinian peace could finally be achieved. Exponentially distant from that moment. Trump, in an article I was reading, is coming to the rescue of the same Al-Qaeda freedom fighters who attacked America on 9/11. It is an irony of American foreign policy, but it's been discussed many different times. In the presence of the King of Morocco, whose sartorial sense is quite interesting in this photograph, and the ruler of Ajman, Mohammed bin Zayed, receives Mohammed al-Mazrui. Let's move on to the currency markets. Obviously, the big story is sterling, but the euro is being dragged higher, 116.12, dollar index 95.15, Japanese yen 111.47, Swiss franc 0.9747, the pound, as I said, 130.56. Australian dollars probably getting lifted. Let's have a look. 0.7125, India rupee 72.425, fresh record low. South Korean won 11.2560. The real slid again 408.65. Egyptian pound strengthened 17.8395. They seem to have bagged the biggest cash from that FOCAC meeting. South African rand 15.1941. I'm short. Dollar index, my stock remains at 94. It's been some hard work trying to break through that 96 level. We're currently at 95.15. Euro dollar, my stop is at 117.50, a long way away, but we're currently at 116.12. Commodity markets, gold strengthening a little bit, 1195.50 last. I still think we're going down to $1,000. Crude oil, now this is held up stronger than most in the commodity complex, if not all, currently trading at $67.51. Emerging markets, trade war worries push emerging currencies to 17-month low. The sell-off in emerging markets deepened on speculation the US-China trade war will escalate. Currencies slumped to their lowest level since April 2017 as Goldman said its model signaled further declines. For some developing nation stocks also fell. Brazil's real led losses. Peso slid after some traders said the rally triggered by optimism around the IMF expediting funds went too far too fast. Turkish data showed the economy expanded less than forecast, overshadowing bets on another rate hike pushing down the lira. Brazilian real declined 1% to 409.42. Mexico 10-year local bond yield rose to the highest on record. Turkish lira fell 0.8%, 645.78. South Africa's 9-year local bond yield rose to the highest in more than 8 years. Russia 10-year local bond yield flat at highest in more than 2 years. India's rupee tumbled to a new record low as India scrambled to halt decline. And this goes back to February when I was sort of kind of predicting this in a piece I said, the end of Halcyon days. I was using the example of Alcyone, the daughter of Julius and the wife of Sikhs. And, those Halcyon days when Julius calmed the winds so that she could lay her eggs. These became known as Halcyon days, and I was saying we're exiting Halcyon days in emerging and frontier market economies. Same article, I was saying QE is believed to have inflated market valuations as far as emerging, frontier, sovereign, sub-Saharan Africa, and even cryptocurrency markets. And I was also saying at that point, JP Morgan's MB spread was down to 258 basis points, the tightest since mid-2014. We've really blown out, and I said, how long this will last is anybody's guess. I wasn't expecting it to last very long. India rupee closed yesterday at 72.445 at another record low. It's down 11.85% year to date. India's 10-year government benchmark bond yield surged 13 basis points to 8.16%. Turkey, a red cap, is thinking that GDP, while still rising 5% in the second quarter, will be falling in the third quarter, and they're expecting a recovery by the second half of 2018. I wrote a piece on the 13th of August titled Cold Turkey, and this is why. We think GDP will grow by 0% in 2018, 1% in 2019, but we admit this looks pretty optimistic if we look back to 2001, 2002, when in one quarter GDP fell 10%. Who's overshooting the most in emerging markets? It's an interesting analysis from Bloomberg. The Turkish lira has fallen further than necessary to close the country's wide current account deficit. This is Bloomberg Economics' analysis of the relationship between exchange rate movements and trade flows suggests the sell-off has been extended by fear. That goes back to that article in September 2016, Mirrors on the Ceiling, the pink champagne on ice. And I said, what is clear is that we're at the fag end of this party, but fag ends last a long time. Let's move on to sub-Saharan Africa. 60% of Africans are under the age of 25. To see Africa through their eyes is to see a continent brimming with potential and opportunity. And this is my distinction about the born-free generation. And also something I wrote in November 2014, Ouagadougou's signal to sub-Saharan Africa. And I said, what's clear is that a very young, very informed, very connected African youth demographic whom many characterize as a demographic dividend, but for beautiful Blaise Compaoré turned into a demographic terminator, is set to alter the existing equilibrium between the rulers and the subjects, and a rebalancing has begun. Uganda is the best example at this moment. African cities surge to top of global growth league. Karim Kane is a carpenter, not a speculator, but the plot of land he bought a decade ago is worth nearly 25 times what he paid for it. In 2007, the village chief sold it to him for the equivalent of $450. Mr. Kane built a house for his wife and 6 children on land that is today, he reckons, worth nearly $11,000. He says, I'm a Bamakois, using the French word for a citizen of Bamako. Almost unnoticed, Africa has become the world's most rapidly urbanizing continent. From 2018 to 2035, the UN predicts that the world's 10 fastest growing cities will all be African. It's a trend that has already enveloped Mr. Kane, whose land has been swallowed up by Yurimadio, the fastest growing part of Bamako, which may itself be the fastest growing city in Africa. According to a World Bank study, 472 million people in sub-Saharan Africa live in cities. High birth rates and migration from the countryside mean by 2040 Africa's urban population will more than double to 1 billion, a rate that far outpaces urbanization elsewhere in the world. Estimates from the United Nations say other cities, including Dar es Salaam, a city of nearly 5 million in Tanzania, are growing even faster than Bamako. Some of Africa's megacities, including Lagos, that's the capital of 21 million people, and Kinshasa, are sucking in hundreds of thousands of new people each year. Smaller cities such as Yaoundé in Cameroon and Brazzaville in Congo are growing almost as fast. From 2015 to 2045, McKinsey found 24 million more Africans would be living in cities each year compared to 11 million in India, 9 million in China. Urbanization has a strong correlation with the rate of real GDP growth, it said, adding that productivity in cities is more than double that in the countryside. For me, this is a catastrophe foretold, said Isia Ndiaye, a professor of philosophy at the University of Bamako. Bamako is a time bomb, he said. Rapid urbanization has left people bereft of services. There's been no planning whatsoever of the road system, water drainage, electricity, or urban transport. The city is becoming more and more unlivable. The World Bank's lead economist for urban development in Africa says the continent's urbanization is running ahead of its income. Africa, he says, is 40% urban with a per capita gross GDP product of roughly $1,100. By the time Asia reached 40% urbanization, its GDP per capita was $3,500, he says. This is an aerial view of pedestrians and vehicles in Bamako's central market. Djibouti has nationalized DP World's shares in the Red Sea port, took full control of its Red Sea container port from DP World, the latest twist in a long-running dispute between the partners. Nationalized DP World shares in the Dorale container terminal, ending a concession agreement that it claimed was severely prejudicial to the fundamental interests of the Republic of Djibouti. Dubai-based logistics company had a 33.33% stake in the DCT company that has operated Dorale since 2006, but had taken de facto control of the terminal, the government said. In practice, DCT has been operated through the shareholders' agreement for the sole purpose of serving DP World's interest. The dispute is part of a wider strategic maneuvering in which several countries and companies are jostling for control of ports and shipping routes positioned on the Red Sea, a narrow waterway separating the east coast of Africa from the Gulf, in a thoroughfare For 30% of world shipping cargo, Darale is one of East Africa's busiest ports and the key transit point for imports to Ethiopia. I wrote about this when I visited Durban. I said then Djibouti and even Lapset, both projects which seemed to me to have been predicated to some degree on a permanent freeze between Ethiopia and Eritrea. In that article titled The Indian Ocean Economy in a Port Race, I said today from Massawa, Eritrea, admittedly on the Red Sea, to Djibouti, from Berbera to Mogadishu, from Lamu to Mombasa, to Tanga, to Bagamoyo, to Dar es Salaam, through Beira and Maputo, all the way to Durban. And all points in between, we're witnessing a port race of sorts as everyone seeks to get a piece of the Indian Ocean port action. China, Gulf countries who now appear to see the Horn of Africa as their hinterland, Japan and India to a lesser degree, are all jostling for optimal geo-economic positioning. I said the big risk is that some of these port investments will be handband-toted. Investments in ports have a long lead time, and I'm not certain that those same investments are able to recalibrate at the speed with which the geopolitics is moving. At one time, circa 2007, I joked that China was trying to buy the Bab el-Mandeb by controlling ports and land in Djibouti and Yemen. This is from Papa Holtz. No, which is not to say that it shouldn't be regarded seriously. Africa's future will be determined most of all, though, by African leadership or lack thereof. Is the important point. Zimbabwe's new finance minister is mulling scrapping bond notes. This is according to Reuters, may scrap the quasi-currency bond note and liberalize exchange controls as part of reforms he plans to implement by the end of this year. There are $350 million worth of bond notes in circulation, according to the latest central bank figures. VW is mulling Ethiopia in its Africa foray, exploring expansion into Ethiopian component assembly is the initial business we're looking at. Vehicle assemblies also under consideration in the long term. Uganda police spokesperson Emilian Kayima is seen being evacuated by his juniors from the burial of the late Muhammad Kirumira. They were stoned by the public. That goes back to the piece I read recently, The Wind of Change is blowing through the continent, whether we like it or not. This growth of national consciousness is a political fact. And I said, then I refer you to Uganda. Bobby and Barbie Wine have now arrived in the US. But what caught my attention was a video of revelers at a terrorist rally concert while chanting people power through bottles at Bebe Cool, a regime apologist musician who was on stage performing and later ended his performance. I said inflection points are difficult to discern, but this is one right here. South African land prices have dropped 32% on land reform, a change in drought. Farm prices in South Africa have plunged by a third since the ruling party decided to seek a change to the constitution to make it easier to expropriate land without compensation, and as commodity prices fell due to bumper harvests following the drought. Average price of a hectare of agricultural land is 43% lower than in April 2016. When I was in Durban, there was full-blown panic around this. Cyril Ramaphosa is going to have to choose between saving the country or saving the party. He can't do both. They are mutually exclusive. Peter du Toit. 27th of August, I was advocating the buying of one-year maturity, one-touch ZAR puts with a 17th strike, and I was saying then it's at risk of a precipitous asymmetric downside move. The article was called "The ZAR Gets Caught Up in the Crossfire." South African oil shares down 4.69%. Dollar versus Rand, we're at 15.1941. I'm short, my stop is at 14.65. Egyptian pound, 17.8395. Can Nigeria's rainmakers really control the weather? I would just like the photograph. Nigerian oil share down 12.11% and in a bear market. Ghana's stock exchange is up 6.51% year to date. Somerset Capital says investors are getting worried about countries like Kenya, Oman, Egypt and Pakistan that have relatively high stocks of external debt. Government security holdings here in Kenya stood at 1.1 trillion shillings in the period, from 999.5 billion in the comparable period a year earlier. This is predicted and predictable consequence of the rate cap. The banks have stampeded into the government bond market. My piece over the weekend was about the VAT, tax and spend. Also, it's a consumption tax. The introduction of VAT is estimated by Bloomberg to raise 71 billion shillings a year. And I concluded by saying the reality is that the government of Kenya is simply in no position to go that VAT. But I was saying the bigger challenge is this. Clearly the VAT imposition is going to ripple through the economy, dial up inflation, dial down consumer spending power. Quite an extraordinary documentary by BBC Africa Eye, hunting down gangsters with Kenya's Ahmed Rashid, a little bit unputdownable, frankly, and quite scary. Nairobi all share down 5.09% year to date, NSE 20 down 17.33% year to date, both slumping now. Daybreak in the gorgeous city of Nairobi have a prosperous week ahead, photo by